Thanks very much for all being here for the talk. Obviously, it's an incredibly important issue to be discussing here in New Zealand. We've had similar initiatives in Australia recently, and I don't want to sound negative, but I think Australia's a wee bit further forward in terms of pushing these lines and getting some initiatives behind it. And I don't know if it's that there's better funding in Australia for this. I think that there is, because I'm really struggling to find a lot of research coming out of New Zealand around some of these issues and some of these reports that are getting generated in Australia. So hopefully some of the talk will stimulate a little bit more of this research and some advocacy and some lobbying in order to focus on this issue by funders, I guess, in New Zealand as well, because you desperately need it. I'm going to cover a range of things today. Some of it's old and boring and still worth covering, and some of it's new and some data which I've just put together. So it's a bit of everything and brand spanking new, so even I don't know some of it yet. So let's see how we go. First off, I want to acknowledge Sherilyn Carr, who's a postdoc with me, who's put together with a lot of slides. And I want to thank Alcohol Action, Lindsay Aitken for running around after me and getting me sorted out. I'm pretty disorganised at the best of times. Doug Salmon and Jenny Connor as well have been very, very generous in getting me across here. And some of the funding agencies that I've been involved with. One of them, AMFA, which is the Australian National Preventive Health Agency, has been particularly proactive in this area in Australia in trying to get rid of alcohol industry sponsorship and advertising in sport. And in fact, has brought out most of the sporting codes in Australia, with the exception of the 4 buffed sports. And the 4 buffed sports are rugby, cricket, rugby league, and AFL. And they're resisting, and sure enough, with some of the data here, you'll see why they're resisting. Why am I interested in alcohol advertising and sponsorship in sport? It's because I really think that it's where the home of alcohol marketing is. I'm going to also talk today about advertising codes and self-regulation and how these are not really working and how they're not protecting our children at all. Why they're poorly formulated and also poorly reasoned and not enforced in the least, certainly in Australia, and we've got some evidence for that as well. I suspect the same here in New Zealand, but again, I haven't seen the reports to critically assess this here. I think there's 2 options which we can come out of this with, and one is that we have a complete ban on alcohol advertising and sponsorship, and especially in sport. The other is that we need stronger and independent regulation of alcohol advertising and sponsorship. And this would mean that we need to redraw all those codes. Because if you've sat down and you've read all the advertising codes, they're actually pathetic and so vague and so non-precise and illogical that we need to start from scratch on those advertising codes. And we need to be enforcing them. So even if there can't be industry self-regulation of this. It's patently obvious that doesn't work. Okay, so alcohol industry sponsoring of sport. Sport is the primary vehicle for alcohol industry marketing of alcohol to young people. Figures suggest it's around 60 to 80% of all the marketing dollars are spent by the alcohol industry are in sport through sponsorship deals, such as buying out the NHL or professional football around the world, and through the advertising which occurs within it as well. Why? Well, alcohol sponsorship and advertising in sport allows industry to bypass advertising regulations aimed at protecting children and young people, i.e. the day or the time in which you're allowed to show it. So we have regulations on the times of the day in which you're allowed to show alcohol adverts, and we have those because we know that they affect children and they influence them to drink. But guess what? It seems it's okay in which to have them during sport. Sport is also associated with strong emotion and identity. When you go along to watch your favourite team and an advert or whatever adverts are being promoted at that point in time, we know that you're psychologically primed in which to store that information and store that positive association as well. And so I'm going to present some cognitive data as well, which is showing that this is happening and it's unconsciously becoming ingrained in children's brains. So no matter what you do as a parent, you're not going to overcome these associations which are in the environment. And this is an example of just some of the expenditures. This is Anheuser-Busch for 6 months of the year in its funding in sport, on TV sport. And overall what you can see is, take-home message here is in 2008 they spent 83% of their advertising budget, which was $171 million. in sport, and then 81% of it in the first 6 months, which was nearly $200 million just in TV sport. So the investment in this is just huge, and which is why I think we should be putting a really strong focus on it. There's a reason why they stick the advertising in and around sport. I don't need to convince you that it's everywhere probably. Australia, I think, may be worse than New Zealand. I really don't know because I haven't been in New Zealand for a long time. But I mean, this is wallpaper, basically. This is something that you might go to the store and buy. It's so sort of out there. I have this picture of Ricky Ponting here with his VB cap on because he was announcing that he was having to send Andrew Simons home, one of their best players, because once again he'd been caught going out drinking from the clubs. And so it's sort of ironic that, you know, the VB is their sponsor and they're saying don't drink and whatever else, and I'm sending you home just while wearing the VB cap. I think it shows a lack of self-awareness in a way as to what they're doing. And of course, in Australia, there's lots and lots of competitions online to encourage kids, which are fun, to get into beach cricket, and it's all linked with the alcohol and fun, basically. New Zealand has its problems as well, so obviously Steinlager has been a primary sponsor here. It's just everywhere in Australia, basically, anywhere you look. If it's state of origin, the thing you'll see on the state of origin jerseys is either 4X for a Queensland team or VB for a New South Wales team. We've got it here, the Steinlager Trophy. What's the Steinlager Trophy for? I haven't been in New Zealand long enough. Is Steinlager Trophy the competition trophy or no? Anyway, Steinlager is still a major sponsor, and so too is VB in Australia for cricket, and it's everywhere. You don't need to be in New Zealand or Australia in which to see this. If you're watching any international sports whatsoever, you're going to be exposed to this as well, which is a problem which Sally alluded to, that it's cross borders now as well. Of course, what this leads us to do is it leads us to watch this sport, and I don't know about you, but as soon as you think that you're going to be going and watching a sporting event, do you think that you should take some beers around to that person's house in order to enjoy the game? I sort of pretty much guarantee it. So I think the two have become so intertwined that it's something that automatically happens. I've got here a couple of commercials, which are the sort of commercials which you see in and around sport, and these are taken directly from some data that we collected for 2012, showing these adverts and compelling, and they do two different things, I think. Give us a go on the hand.
There's two things that define a man, his left hand and his right. Take a look at yours. Every scar is a memory, each callus a job done. Because when it's handmade, it's made well. Hand cut, hand polished, and then handed down. Be hands-on. Get them dirty. Yep, you can tell a lot about a man by his hands.
Okay, so that's one ad around masculinity, what it is to be an Australian and what an Australian does. And, you know, after a hard day's work, an Australian has a beer. These are during the cricket matches. These in the past few months have been just every second advert on TV and around sporting events. I'll get you to grab the other one as well. So it's the beer.
I'm dying. And I am scared. Line up. No worry now. Just getting himself all pretty. A little bit of the old lady magnet juice. Boom! Who's next? Every time you buy a Canadian Club, a beer fairy dies. Refresh your drink, Canadian Club.
These ads are brilliant. I mean, I love these ads. They're compelling, they grab you, and kids love them as well, and kids are being modelled by what this is. I mean, they're very, very good. I was hoping that Canadian Dry might reduce beer drinkers in some way, you know, because it's making them out to be beer fairies, and yeah, in fact, that sort of stereotype isn't a nice stereotype, but the fact that all that you take home is that it's a funny, compelling ad, and you have a positive association with alcohol straight away. The industry here is so strong, the alcohol industry is so strong now that it dictates to sport what goes on. I wrote a paper recently and some commentaries and such, and I said that anyone going to Australia and New Zealand could be forgiven for thinking that sport is a subsidiary of the alcohol industry. And I really think it is. It's at that point. So, of course, the FIFA World Cup, it's the biggest sporting event in the world, the most watched and so on. In Brazil, since 2003, they've banned all alcohol in stadiums because of violence-related problems. And it was basically enshrined in law. However, such is the influence of alcohol marketing on FIFA, they've forced them to have alcohol in stadiums now in Brazil. So it'll be interesting to see what the outcome of that is. But the fact that you can dictate to a government and to its policy via the sports administrators as well buying into this, I think is appalling. And, we criticise the industry, but, and we should, duly. However, the sports administrators are just appalling as well. In Australia, recently, there is nothing clean about Australian sport right now. Nothing clean. It's advertising, there's cheating, there's drugs, there's tobacco, not tobacco anymore, thankfully, and so on and so on, fast foods. And so it's a disgrace, and the sports administrators have allowed that disgrace to happen. And so sport is about us, and it's about what we want, it's about what our children want. It's not about what the industry wants, per se. And of course, it's going to have an impact on this. This is what it's all going to do. It's going to drag our kids down. It took me a long time to get those kids to do that properly, I've got to say. I've got another picture later with British children. It was much easier to train them. If we look in New Zealand, and this is data provided in a Spark report, Spark said there was no problem at all with alcohol in sport in New Zealand. And at that conference that I attended, which I think Doug attended, I duly tore strips off them with that thoughts. If we look at the amount of sports clubs that have bars in them and licensed bars in them which to use, compare them to other on licenses, they make up 24% of New Zealand's bars are actually in sports clubs. So if you've got kids going along to these clubs, large clubs, which they do at the lower grades, then these kids are being exposed in this setting as well in New Zealand. Of course, this flows on to direct alcohol industry sponsorship, where I've done research in New Zealand, Australia, and the UK, and it's all really, really consistent in terms of what goes on. So basically, we look at, and I dare say members of the audience here have been sponsored. Certainly, I was sponsored for my sports. You form a relationship with a bar or a pub or a liquor outlet or whatever it might be, and they provide you with some cheap alcohol or $3,000 for sporting equipment, or pay your membership fees or some travel costs, so on and so on and so on. In return for that, they require you to come back to their bar and to drink after practices and to drink on weekends and so on and after games. And in doing so, you then bring along your friends to those venues as well. And if you're a successful team, then they follow you. So I remember in Dunedin, the Otago Highlanders were sponsored by the Bowling Green Tavern for a period of time, so they always had to go back there. I think Bowling Green Tavern's dead now, is it? It now belongs to the university, trying to make money out of the bar, are they? No, good. And so a lot of people used to go to that bar in order to support that team and to get involved. And so they made their money back well and truly in that regard. So we looked at those who were receiving and not receiving in New Zealand in the first studies in New Zealand. And we wanted to see if there was a difference between those who received alcohol sponsorship and those who didn't receive alcohol sponsorship, and whether that was affecting their drinking. A simple study, but it had never been done. So as always, the politicians will say, where's the evidence? And so you've got to collect it, no matter how obvious it might be. We took measures with the audit, Alcohol Use Disorders Identification Test, which is a WHO measure, and it establishes hazardous drinking levels. We had a response rate of 85% and about 1,300 participants, sporting participants. Mean age was 31 years, so it wasn't just university students, it wasn't just clustered in the young kids who typically drink high anyway. 48% were women. We found that 47% of participants reported receiving alcohol-related industry sponsorship of some kind. And here's some of the kinds that they received. So they were 27% reported receiving free alcohol. And I did. Certainly after a cricket game, I went back to the cricket dressing rooms, and there's normally a couple of dozen cans of beer from the bar that we would drink there straight away, basically. Discounted alcohol, so we would go back to the bar, and our first jugs would be maybe $2 a jug if we went back to the bar. I know that in Australia, in the rugby league, around the Rugby League World Cup, they were giving the Australian rugby league players $1,000 drink cards so that they could go and take that card around to any bar they wanted and drink up their $1,000 worth of drinks on that. So, it's more extensive the higher up the chain you go. And of course, there were significant amounts of free or discounted. Lots of people got free or discounted. And then there was also non-alcohol related things such as money or equipment. But those were also tied with the need for you to go back to the alcohol providers' residences, basically, and outlets. We found that those receiving sponsorship of any kind had higher drinking scores than those not receiving sponsorship on the audit scores. And this difference was significant. And this is after modelling a host of different activities in some regression models, but I won't bore you with the models. The paper is out in 2008. Australia, I found a similar pattern in Australia, so I won't bore you with that one. It works out about the same as what it does in New Zealand, but we did it with a smaller sample. Just completed a study in the UK where we looked at 5 different regions of England in order to get some sort of understanding of what was happening there in the UK. And so there was 2,100 athletes. They were similar to previous studies in New Zealand. However, we took into account a lot more things like how much disposable income did you have during the end of the week. So if you, say, don't have much disposable income, chances are you may go and try to get some alcohol sponsorship to allow you to do some drinking, and so on and so on and so on. We looked at where they were living. Did they seek out the sponsorship themselves, or did a sponsor approach them? So that we could deal slightly with some of the causal effects as well. Basically what we found is that those were sponsored, and this is just the audit consumption score. The audit consumption score ranges from 0 to 12. Maximum score you can get is 12, minimum score you can get is 0. And what we see here is that we have overrepresentation of those who were sponsored at the higher levels of the drinking. So on this here's 10 points. Remember, 12 is the maximum. Overrepresented of alcohol-sponsored people, and down here not so. So we get a really strong effect there. In terms of modelling the data really comprehensively, and I know this is a mess, so don't worry about it. What it shows, effectively, if you focus on this little red circle here, is that on that range of drinking scores, of consumption scores of 1 to 12, if you're receiving team sponsorship, you score 1.52 points higher on that drinking score if you've received that. If you receive club, you're drinking, or you're getting 2.16 points higher, and so on and so on and so on. So there's a really strong effect, and that's after accounting for nearly every other variable we could think of. We even entered in whether or not you sought out the sponsorship yourself, or whether they approached you, and we didn't find that reduced the model at all. So it's a pretty strong effect. Now, I know we think that that's just influencing those that are receiving the sponsorship, but does it have a wider context? If you are a parent who is sponsored at one of these clubs and gets alcohol sponsorship through that club, do your kids coming along to watch your game get influenced by those sorts of things as well? I don't have the evidence for that. However, there has been some other evidence come out, which I'm going to allude to in a second. So, as Sally said, there's a fairly good body of evidence showing associations between exposure to alcohol advertising and marketing, and then drinking in children, and certainly early initiation and more positive attitudes and expectancies around this. And Sally's done some of the best work in this back in the 90s. But we could always do more of it, I must say, especially with good longitudinal studies. So it's reasonably well established base of what's going on. This isn't changing policy. Politicians. I attended a policy meeting in Canberra, at which we had round tables with the politicians there, and 3 of the politicians said, we need more evidence. There's not enough evidence. This is not compelling enough. So we don't actually think this is an evidence thing that we've got here, an evidence problem here, though it doesn't hurt to have something that hits them over the head a lot more firmly. So here's a report on the impact of European alcohol marketing exposure on youth alcohol expectancies and youth drinking. This is just out, so I think I discovered it online, and maybe only 2 weeks ago it's come out. And this is by AMFRA, which is a large group called Alcohol Measures of Public Health Research Alliance. I don't know if Sally has any role with this, or do you know of them, Sally? Yeah. However, this is a lovely study. So, of course, in Europe, they're exposed to this sort of advertising all the time. The Champions League is a huge competition, in fact, the most watched competition yearly in the world, and their primary sponsor is Heineken. So the AMFORA study, there was a longitudinal study of 6,651 children, aged 13.9 years, from Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Poland. In study one, they wanted to look at whether or not exposure to online marketing, such as emails, mobile phone, pop-ups, websites, etc., might be related to increased drinking expectancies and increased drinking at a later time point. They also looked at whether or not exposure to alcohol-branded sports sponsorship and whether or not you're associated with a sports club that receives sponsorship was related to drinking behaviours as well. And so the outcomes were that they assessed drinking expectancies and drinking at time 1 and then at time 2 to see what the effects were. Now, I had some fancy tables with all the numbers in it, but I deleted them literally about half an hour ago because I thought I'm not going to get into that. But this is the primary findings worth looking at here. So our findings indicate that higher exposure to online alcohol marketing is associated with higher expectancies of alcohol, and this is positive expectancies towards it, and higher odds of drinking, and that this effect is maintained over time. The AMFORA survey data indicated that European youngsters report high exposure to alcohol-branded sports sponsorship on TV and in sports clubs. The finding reported here indicate that higher exposure to alcohol-branded sports sponsorship is associated with higher alcohol expectancies and higher frequencies of recent drinking, and that this effect was also sustained over time. And the impact of alcohol-branded sports sponsorship is no different from the impact of exposure to other types of alcohol marketing. Consequently, policy initiatives need to be comprehensive and to address alcohol marketing in its varied forms. So effectively, the sponsorship we've been talking about on the ground appears to be affecting the children as well who are exposed to this. Sponsorship needs to come under the same umbrella as advertising does, and at the moment, they've got a great one here because they just sponsor the event, put their billboards up around a particular event and a sporting event, and because it doesn't come under the regulatory codes, they can have as much of that within a stadium as they want. They then film it. The children are then exposed to it. I don't know if you've watched the cricket test recently, but if it's in Australia, the sight board, which is at the opposite end, so behind the batsman, whenever the batsman, it's facing the batsman, they can put any advertising on it that they want. And what they have is they have VB on it. Every time, and this has been, just a godsend to the cricketing nation, I dare say, when instant replays come to other sports, it will be there as well. But on the action replay or on the decision board, they have their scoreboard, and either side of the scoreboard they have VB signs, either side of the scoreboard. So whenever they're waiting for a decision or looking at a replay, either side of that replay is the two VB signs, and that's not counted as advertising. That's just counted as a perk of the sponsorship. Alcohol advertising codes and regulations. And these are typically, usually self-regulated. So there's an acknowledgement. They have these advertising codes, right? And in these advertising codes, they say, we don't want you to do this, advertise during these times because it affects children and may influence their drinking. And yet the alcohol industry says that advertising doesn't influence drinking. So it's just not correct. Why would they set up their own advertising codes which say, we can't do this because it affects children, and then whenever we say, well, advertising is having this effect, they say it doesn't. So they've caught themselves out in a wee way, and we need to point those irregularities out to them. No matter what it is that they chuck into these things, and they're pretty loose, they're not necessarily being adhered to. The number one thing is that they shouldn't be advertising between 6 a.m. and 8:30 p.m. So it's supposed to be banned. It's a critical time when children are supposed to be watching. There's not supposed to be any advertising at all. We've also found that 8:30 to 9:30 p.m. is a very high viewing time for children. And if any of you have got kids now, you probably know they're staying up a bit later than what I did anyway. Mind you, I used to get thrashed and sent to bed very early. So the problems, they're weak, they're not enforced. I'm going to give an example of Bundy R beer. Not supposed to be on between 6 or 7 a.m., depending on which country you are, and 8:30 p.m. because we acknowledge that it harms children. And if it harms children, why a 25% threshold? So it's okay to have 24%? This is ludicrous. If it harms children, this is a silly threshold. it's got to be removed. These got to be rewritten. But it's okay at any time during sport. So children watch later in the day. Alcohol sponsorship often not counted as advertising in the regulations. So here's in Australia a common one, which is Bundy Beer. Of course, Bundy Beer has a whole lot of TV series or TV shows and commercials where he acts as a gunfighter against some evil guys, and he's got a can of Bundaberg pre-mixed, which he gets, and it's really appealing, lovely, cool, uses animals which kids connect with, so on and so on and so on, and a bugbear for a health promoter. So there was a complaint made to the Alcohol Beverage Advertising Code, which is the regulatory panel for this, by Ms. Lynn Fielder, who works with Rob Donovan over in Western Australia. And they criticised this Bundy R beer ad. The advertiser is Diageo. The decision came down. This use of Bundy R beer does not, in the context of the ad, in the panel's review, breach the ABAC standard. Accordingly, the complaint is dismissed in terms of this. Now, obviously, the beer has this appeal, so on and so on and so on, but what are you going to do? Well, Rob Donovan goes out and says, well, right, let's run the study to see exactly what harm this does do and what kids are doing on this. And so he decided to look at the Bundy beer ad, so he recruited 11 to 17-year-olds to test their liking for Bundy beer and their connection and so on and so on and so on, because that's why it was rejected. They didn't think that you would form a connection with Bundy beer, so therefore it's okay to use them in the ad. So 86% of boys and 60% of girls recognise the character. In fact, there's another study showing that Bundy beer was more recognised than Mickey Mouse. 90% described Bundy R beer as friendly and good to have at a party. 80% rated him funny and laid back. 75% of all children correctly associated Bundy beer with a bottle of Bundaberg rum, which is what he represents. When they decided to go and ask adults, a sample of adults as well, to say, look, here's the ABAC code and here's the Bundy ad. Now, according to these criteria, how do you feel about this ad? Is this ad breaching or not breaching criteria? And so when the ABAC guidance was given, almost 70% of the adults said the ad would have evident appeal to children. Over three-quarters, 77%, said the ad would have evident appeal to adolescents. So code and self-regulation, the codes and self-regulations is not working. And of course it's going to lead to this. So these are these British kids, and they were much better at this. You can tell it's from Manchester, it's a freezing cold, dark place. The extent and nature of alcohol advertising during TV sport in Australia. I'm just cognizant of time. How much time have I got left? 5 minutes? Brilliant. I decided to look at the extent and nature of alcohol advertising in TV sport in Australia, and I actually am able to look at other genres as well in terms of how much it forms up. So our question was, how much advertising is there in sport TV compared to other genres, and how much of it is during times when children are not supposed to be watching or not supposed to be exposed to this? So 6 a.m. to 8:30 p.m, commercial television industry codes. This is what the formal governmental codes are. We got data on all alcohol advertising around sport TV and non-sport genres for Australia in 2012. So the data's red hot. Also found non-sporting alcohol slots, so we've got all those as well. We also went and got monitoring data which is produced by Nielsen on when kids are actually watching TV. So when during the day they are watching the TV as well. They have set-top boxes in homes and have codes, and they identify who's watching when. Okay, so note that sport is considerably less than 10% of all TV. But here we've got the amount of minutes in alcohol advertising which are occurring in sport versus other programming, all other programming. So basically we've got sometimes at least 30% of the advertising across months is in sport. Up here. Despite it being less than 10% of all TV airtime in which the opportunity is to do the ad. If we look at the times between 6 a.m. and 8:30 p.m, this is why I'm angry about sport getting off the hook here, and why alcohol advertising in sport and sponsorship in sport is the problem. Because now we look at it, and for sport primarily, we find that nearly all of the advertising, the frequency of the adverts, is in sport, not other programming. It's in and around sport. And it's during the times which are the breach times. Sport has this leeway, it's allowed to. and frankly it shouldn't be. The December anomaly is that it's December, it's leading up to Christmas time. There's actually only some cricket matches on there, but December's, I don't know what happens with December, but they get away with all the discount special advertising at that time of the year. We look at this, we've tracked, and hopefully you can see this clearly, we've tracked the times when children are watching the most. Now, the big jump up here with this group, which is the 18 to 29s, the reason that that number is so high is that's a greater number of years, so it's 11 years between this age gap, whereas there's only 3 years between this age gap and only 8 years between this age gap. So the reason this is much higher than these, if we adjust for the amount of age years in that category, it drops back down here. But regardless, what we're seeing here is we're seeing that kids who are of 14 to 17, which is considerable amounts of it, are watching at times when all this alcohol advertising is occurring. So they're being exposed to this alcohol advertising. If we go to this figure, and this is sport-only programming. So sport-only programming occurs during the day quite a lot because that's when we've got sporting events showing. So AFL matches and so on showing. So we've got a high exposure here. You may say, oh, the lines are down a wee bit, but these may be unique viewers. So you may actually be, at this time, have 10,000 kids, then at this other time, totally 10,000 different kids. And when you add up that across this time slot, across days, across months, and so on and so on and so on, the number of children being exposed to this advertising is just prolific. And particularly up in this time as well, which is rugby league and some of the AFL games. You get a dip around here because the game's finished at that point in time. These are the sports which are the most problematic, and you'll see the buffet sports are the ones which are most problematic, which is the AFL, the cricket, the rugby league, and rugby doesn't actually do much in Australia. I think it's the opposite way around here. Rugby will be your biggie here in cricket. There's a little bit in the supercars, which is sort of ironic, you know, driving and alcohol don't go that well together. And there's the tennis, which is a biggie as well. And I think you've got Heineken Cup here, do you? Yep, so that'll be a big chunk of yours. These are really simple analyses that you could be doing here in New Zealand. If anybody's interested in knowing how we go about the protocol, please approach me. If we look at specifically at AFL here, and AFL is the big sport in Australia, during these times from 6 a.m. to 8:30, that's where you've got your most kids watching as well. So there's massive exposure. I know I'm running out of time. The association between sport and alcohol is so strong that I believe it gets into our unconscious as well. So there's a task that you can do, which is an unconscious priming task. It's called the implicit association test. And what you do is you look at the speed in which categorizations of words can be made when you're supposed to make categories according to two codes. So we looked at how quickly people were able to make a correct categorization when an alcohol-related word popped up in the presence of a sport word versus when a soda drink popped up in the presence of a sport word. Now, if you supposedly, if say one word more or goes more with the other word, so if alcohol goes more with sports, you'll be quicker in your own head to automatically do it. And we're talking in hundreds of milliseconds. So we tested this to see whether or not this was occurring. And we got a difference within a 20-second span of time in a paper and pencil version. People were able to correctly categorize 8.4 more words when alcohol was associated with a sport than when any other soda drink was associated with a sport, or when alcohol was associated with exercise and so on. So sport is the key one. Alcohol is really rapidly associated with sport-related words, and this is sinking in ahead. We're doing experiments now where we're just laying a cricket bat in a room, and then we've got a computer set up, so they just walk into the room, and there's just a cricket bat in the room. And what we're finding is a primed effect, just at the exposure of the cricket thing, to positive associations with alcohol. So the mere mention of sport is priming people's associations in head with alcohol. And you can't control that as a parent. That's built up across time through the exposure, repeated exposure that we've got in the environment. So children and adolescents are currently exposed to large volumes of appealing alcohol advertising and sponsorship. New evidence continues to confirm that exposure to alcohol advertising and sponsorship influences children's drinking and drinking-related thoughts. Current alcohol advertising codes are weak, poorly designed, and poorly enforced. New codes need to be developed and enshrined in law and administered independently of vested interests. Research evidence is having limited impact on change in terms of policy in the government. A ban on alcohol advertising and sponsorship in sport is warranted. AMFA is pushing for it, and we've already achieved it in tobacco. But members of the general public need to be engaged with this issue and demand policy change. And public health groups could lead this type of initiative. I agree completely with Sally and others who said that educational campaigns are not going to work when there's a better educational campaign saying the opposite. Thanks very much, and happy to field any questions.
With the research that you did on the Bundy bear, was that then, did another complaint go in stating the new information that you had?
No, no, it was just there really to mock them and to show how flawed it is. Nothing is changing with that system. Mike Dorb is setting up an alternate system to bring in some complaints through that network and then releasing them each month to show this is flawed. But the industry doesn't pay too much attention to any of them anyway. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Nick. I'm also from the Waikato District Health Board. Just a question in terms of a lot of these sports groups with their sponsorship at the grassroots level would say that they're almost dependent on that sponsorship to, you know, like in a rural area or an area that doesn't have a lot of options, they might have to go to the local bar or whatever to get that sponsorship. Are there any sports that you can sort of point out that have gotten around that, have found other ways to sponsor?
Yeah, well, every sport in Australia, with the exception of the four cricket, rugby, rugby league, and so have. So they get a small amount. When you look at the actual dollars that is involved in it, it's quite minimal. So it's like $3,000, $5,000 here and there. I mean, the alternative to this is, like, I'm happy for the alcohol industry to continue funding sport, but we take it from their taxes. So we ring fence some of the tax, so hypothecation. And, you know, if you took 1 cent basically on a beer, Tim Stockwell did an analysis one time in the Northern Territories about what could happen with a 1 cent increase in the price of a beer. And it generates something for like $120 million within a 6-month period of time. So there are options there in which to do that, to ring fence. The government just needs to take the initiative. But if the government thinks that sport is so healthy and it's such a great thing to do, and I'm sure the general public of New Zealand do, then when you pitch it to say we're going to increase a tax or we're going to take a tax on beer, you would back that up as long as they're not going to chuck it into some coffers in which it disappears off the face of the planet. If you say this is ring fenced specifically for sport, you've got to be addressing obesity issues, you know, social integration, physical activity in sport, all these cultural mores, and that money absolutely has to go to that. Then you've got backing for it. And we did a study on that in the UK, and we had 70% support when we gave a whole lot of options and described what the options were, right? People supported a slight increase in the price of alcohol if it went to sport, no other way, but if it went to sport and funding healthy endeavours, then they did. Any other questions?
Have you studied the sponsorship of school-age kids' sport?
I haven't studied the school-age kids' sport, mainly because of difficulty getting access. But the AMFA study has sort of done it for me, and I'm really pleased it has, because I haven't seen any sponsorship other than in China and India, where they do sponsor, tobacco companies sponsor schools there, and so too do you know, alcohol industry. So they can do anything that they want there. But the AMFA study has shown that being exposed to a club that has that, so if you're a young child and you go along to the footy club, as we did when we were 5 or 6, and that's sponsored and there's alcohol there, then that affects the attitudes of those kids that are in there. Would be a good one to do. Yeah.
Just about the sports arenas, do the different types of disciplines of sport put it out to tender for who will actually get the bid? Because with some arenas you have at the goalpost, when you look through, you have McDonald's or you have Coca-Cola as well.
Yeah.
So do they put it out to the highest bidder gets it for?
Typically it's the highest bidder, yeah, that will get it. I mean, if you look at UK sport, you see many fewer alcohol industry sponsors. Why? Because you have major banks, major airlines, you know, really big companies are there, and you're talking about, you know, players being paid £5 million or whatever a season, if not more. An alcohol sponsor can't get in there cheaply. You know, the alcohol sponsorship in Australia and New Zealand is through relationships. You know, there's implicit relationship between the people who they get little kickbacks. You know, CEOs in Australian and New Zealand sport are, don't get paid huge amounts of money. So they're quite happy to cave in on anything. The banks are not overly involved there either. And so in the big sports, Manchester United, if you sold Manchester United, it'd fund all professional sport in New Zealand and Australia combined. So they're not going to be influenced by the alcohol industry in the same way that we are. It's a very cheap way in which for them to get mass exposure. And so they pretty much get their way here, but they don't in other countries.